Right. So there's something called manufactured advocacy, and the way in which this works is when there is a public issue or there is a social issue, and then you find or you have so many people advocating for this particular issue or for a specific policy. However, the key difference here is that the specific people who are speaking on these issues do not necessarily have an interest aligned or are doing it for their own specific interests and not necessarily a way to necessarily bring advocacy or shine light upon the issue. Now, there are certain cases where we've seen issues come up, and for example, we've seen chat bots or accounts which necessarily are not real speaking on these issues just to try and generate traffic on some of these issues. Now, don't get me wrong, this has its benefits in terms of reach, in terms of sending the issue far and bringing it to the corridors of the people who are important or the people who necessarily need to listen to it. Because this buzz which is created is important or is essential to be able to carry the issue forward also towards like the people who actually need to make the change. Now, when this whole dissolve the NCA board and MTN issue came up, there was a lot of call outs to influencers generally in Ghana to speak up on this issue. And the reason I'm picking up on this now is because this is not the first time. So this has nothing to do specifically with this issue, but I think it gives a very good opportunity to be able to talk about this kind of advocacy. Now, don't get me wrong, advocacy can be done in so many ways. There's really no single way of being able to bring this level of change. But then also, advocacy is so important that any way in which we can do to bring the desired outcomes is good enough, or is something that we should pursue. But we also need to accept that the way in which we do advocacy does indeed affect the results and the way in which it is perceived in general by the public. And therefore, we need to be super careful when we are doing this, and we need to be sure that this is the right way it's going to bring the outcomes we want. Now, there are a couple of questions to answer under this, and I want to start with the first one. Firstly, do influencers have the obligation to be able to speak on these issues? I think just like with all good questions, the answer is neither yes or no. Some influencers necessarily build their platform specifically based off those issues, and some influencers are statutory advocates. So for example, if you occupy a specific office or you've been delegated with a specific responsibility which has enabled you to have that following, it sort of dawns on you that you have an obligation to speak to these things. But we also do need to recognize that for most of these influencers that we call out on, they have individual platforms, which means that they have by themselves built their own following based on the level of consistency of their art, their craft, or a certain message that they want to put out. That being said, the platform being individual means that it is specifically in their own interest whether they would want to be able to speak on some of these issues or not. And therefore, it becomes their decision. As a result of them holding a certain level of influence, is there a moral expectation on them that they speak? Yes. But is there a principled obligation on them to speak? No. And it's important that we draw the lines here. So I'm happy to give continuous support to influencers who step out of their way to do this, but then I'm unwilling to chastise individuals who decide not to speak on some of these issues. And this is crucial, not just for the principle or moral reason, but for a number of reasons. One, manufactured advocacy leads to uninformed advocacy. Most of the time, when we're pushing celebrities and influencers to jump on some of these issues, you are forcing them to speak on issues for which they do not have a broad understanding on. Now, usually the criticism leveled against this point is that, well, it is buzzing or it is trending, and therefore they need to generally be informed. But recognize that the expectation to be informed does not immediately translate to you being informed. And therefore, most individuals who would jump into this trend without, as a result of the pressure which is being put on them, and without necessarily understanding the issue, would most likely be uninformed. Now, this has massive effects, because an uninformed influencer or someone who is uninformed and doing the advocacy would mean that they are more likely going to spread misinformation. They are more likely going to put the advocacy in a bad light, and most likely would lead to the tarnishing of the legitimacy of that particular advocacy. Secondly, there's consistency in the principle. Some influencers have built their platform on certain specific issues, and therefore speaking on one or two issues more often than not would highlight what their principle or highlight what their mantra is. Sometimes, unfortunately, that position is just not incongruous with what their social philosophy is. They may have a different political view of the whole situation, which most often than not would be diluting what we want to do. But secondly, would be leading to some of these inconsistencies that we speak about. And that's not to mention the personal cost which it comes to them and to their brand. Lastly, it makes the advocacy lose depth, because most of the time when people just pile onto the issue and want to speak about it as a result of them being noticed or them fearing the backlash, What it mostly means that they don't build resilience with the issue to the end, which means that once people stop talking about it and take the attention of them, they are more likely going to also stop talking about it. And if then the advocacy has been built on the shoulders of getting people to speak about these and getting people to contribute, it would mean that it immediately dies out. Okay, what's the way forward then? I think the way forward is we need to understand that there are different ways by which you can do advocacy. For example, with this data situation and dissolving the NCA board, we've seen that one advocate or one influencer, as a result of their persistence and as a result of their own belief, and that's the tech entry influencer on Twitter, has been able to generate enough traction on this issue to get a national discussion ongoing. He didn't need Sarkodie, Kalije, and everyone necessarily speaking directly to it, but he eventually got the ball rolling, which means that when people are genuinely interested in the situation and want to speak about it, there's no limit to the level of advocacy through which it can come. There's no limit to the level of advocacy through which we can achieve from that. There are also many other ways. It's not just about the online advocacy. Sometimes petitions, sometimes civil societies, which necessarily will not maintain a social presence, are all able to carry different levels of these things. And sometimes it's just enough that your own influencers and people who believe in these things subscribe to it. That being said, it doesn't mean that no influencer should speak on some of these issues again. In fact, we need most of them to, as often as they can. But what I want to point out to here is that there is no need to force, or there is no need to pressure individuals into speaking on specific issues, because at the end of the day, it still hurts us. Thank you very much, and I hope you subscribe to the Shafts podcast.